Welcome to Kiffin's Keep, an intellectual resource for the pillar and buttress of the truth, which is the church. This is a project of the London Lyceum, which is an institution dedicated to serious thinking for a serious church. I'm Jordan Stefaniak, host of Kiffin's Keep and president of the London Lyceum. And as always, I'm excited to be here today with you guys. Before we jump into the video, a reminder, go ahead and hit like on the video if you enjoy the content. Hit subscribe if you want to keep up with all of our awesome content that will be coming straight to you. And then do drop a comment if you agree, disagree, or have any other ideas. Love hearing from you guys. Now, without further ado, I wanted to talk a little bit about what is analytic philosophy. One of the most common questions I get, besides what is analytic theology, is what is analytic philosophy? There's no real clear conception on what it is amongst most theologians and most historically oriented theological types, or just historians in general who have a cursory interest in analytic philosophy, or even just random people that I work with who have no idea what analytic philosophy means or is. So I wanted to answer that question, or at least hopefully answer that question a little bit. In short, it is the philosophy of the bad guys. Colossians 2:8 talks about philosophy that we want to avoid, deceitful philosophy, and this is exactly what that is. If you didn't know, I am kidding. I like analytic philosophy. So really, what is analytic philosophy if it's not the philosophy of the bad guys? Well, the term doesn't show up until I think it is 1933. And of course, it is a derogatory term at the beginning. It is the sort of a narrow-minded, small-minded approach to doing philosophy, and it ends up sticking. But there's several ways you could slice this in my mind. Now, I remember being pressed on how do you define analytic philosophy. I don't know how long ago it's been, but on the old Twitter machine, had debate a little bit about what is analytic philosophy. And every answer I gave was not good enough because the thought was, well, this doesn't really clarify how it's distinct from any other philosophy. So let me walk through a couple of approaches you could do or use to define analytic philosophy. So analytic philosophy could be a historical comparison. I think personally, I do think this is an apt way to describe it. It is similar or akin to scholasticism in our own modern context. So scholasticism, if you aren't familiar, a great resource is Introduction to Reformed Scholasticism, right here by Willem J. Van Asselt. And he talks about scholasticism, as most do, as just a method of doing theology in the schools. I think that's exactly what he says. It's a method. It's not associated with content. It's a method, an academic form of argumentation and disputation. He goes on to explain what all that looks like and how the form that ends up taking and the approach that's there and the sort of time referent that it's bound to, where it begins around the 11th century and ends up its heyday. I guess it starts to dissolve around the 17th century or even earlier than that. It really begins to fragment in some ways. The form loses its universal appeal. So you could say that analytic philosophy is just scholasticism in today's clothing. And I think that is actually an apt way to describe it, an apt way to show it. So scholasticism, if you're not familiar, Thomas Aquinas is a great representative. And there's a certain form and structure to doing theology in a scholastic mode. It's not going to say that other modes of doing theology are improper and unhealthy. It's just this is a helpful, useful way to get at, to be clear, to get at the meaning of theology. And so you're going to find numbered objections, numbered replies, and very clear, organized, structured ideas and arguments. So in that way, I think analytic philosophy is actually very close to scholasticism. It's a sort of a scholasticism 2.0, which is very ironic for those who have a negative perception of analytic philosophy. Oftentimes, those who don't like it, at least in my circles, love scholasticism, and yet they don't like analytic philosophy for who knows what reason. It's a method. It's not a doctrinal content. Now, you could describe analytic philosophy also as sort of like a antithesis or a historical contrast of sorts. It's the anti-continental philosophy. So if you're familiar with the sort of the divide, it's overblown a little bit, but really continental philosophy stuff that's done on the continent of Europe things like phenomenology, existentialism, deconstructionism, etc. Now, there's a lot of flaws in this sort of paradigm because there are analytic philosophers who arise in Germany and etc. So how is this supposed to be really truly a divide? Table that. Let's put these contrastive elements of sort of a phenomenology, an existentialist approach to philosophy versus an analytic approach, which is much more logical and mathematical. And you can see there is a significant distinction between these two sort of modes of doing philosophy. It's not that one wants to only talk about one aspect or one question of philosophy, but there's definitely a distinctive mode to doing it. There's a mode of reasoning, a mode of argument, whereas one's going to be more akin to a little bit lack, almost an intentional vagueness for the purpose of trying to unlock later puzzles in ways that aren't possible by pure deductive logic. And the other side is going to say, well, I can do some pretty good solid logic chopping to get to my solution. But there's also, this is probably the most common way to describe analytic philosophy, and it's by a set of sort of methodological virtues. Things like clarity of thinking, precision of expression, rigor of argumentation. Those three things are hallmarks of analytic philosophy, or they're supposed to be. Clarity, precision, rigor. Especially rigor with the use of modern logic. And that, the modern logic piece is really, in my mind, what's distinguishing it from something like scholasticism. So it's not just a time-bound nature where scholasticism, 11th to the 17th or 18th century, whatever it is, and then you have analytic philosophy, 19th, 20th century and onward. It's not just the time nature, it's also the use and deployment of resources like modern logic that didn't exist prior. But there's also, I think, in analytic philosophy, a creativity, a fruitfulness, and a systematicity that are prized virtues. Now, this isn't a vain curiosity. It's more of a being conceptually creative to create and deploy more resources to thinking about a problem. Analytic philosophers are dedicated to really examining all sides of an issue and all sides of a problem and trying to think of new ways to solve old problems. And they might use and deploy old resources, but they might deploy them in a unique way. So I think those might be interesting virtues. But you might say, well, what philosophy isn't dedicated to clarity of thinking? Everybody's dedicated to that, right? How is it analytic philosophy gets the monopoly on this? Well, I do think that there is a sense in which they actually care about it more than other sort of groups of philosophy do. There's also a sort of, I guess, a way to describe analytic philosophy. There is a tendency to have a piecemeal approach to philosophy rather than doing big system building, but I don't know if that's really across the board. One thing I think you could describe analytic philosophy by, as far as methodology goes, is a sort of a project of translation. So you could take the example of analytic versus synthetic geometry. So if you're a nerd and you know all about the difference here, the distinctions here, synthetic geometry is typically sort of ancient Greek sort of geometry, where it had an inability to solve various problems until you have analytic geometry that comes on the scene and ends up using arithmetic and algebra to solve a bunch of geometrical problems. And so it solved these problems by translating the geometry into arithmetic and algebra. In a similar way, analytic philosophy is rephrasing and translating problems into sort of richer conceptual frameworks, or it's formalizing them in an appropriate logical theory to get at the solution to the various problems that might not have been able to been solved previously. So I think you could say it prizes certain virtues. I don't like saying it's piecemeal. There are a lot of analytic philosophers that are piecemeal. You want to get to the smallest little aspect of a problem and deal with it, and that's definitely a propensity among many of them. But it's not really a necessary condition in any sense. But there's also the project of translation. They're trying to do that. They're trying to understand, take a problem and reformulate it in such a way that it's very, very clear and very, very obvious what the problem is and what the solution might be. There's other ways you could trace analytic philosophy, and that's historical genealogy. This is the way that you get to your favorite villain for analytic philosophy. It's started in some senses by Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore, Wittgenstein, and others in the 19th and 20th century, and then it's carried on by logical positivists at times. and you think these guys are bad news. These guys are all the my favorite supervillains. And so yeah, analytic philosophy is bad news. But that's just not how analytic philosophy is today. So that's a genetic fallacy to think that just because it was started by somebody I don't like, therefore what's happening today is bad. Because analytic philosophy today is all across the map. You have analytic dogmatic theology, like what I like to do. You have analytic feminism, analytic Marxism, which is completely opposite end of the spectrum. You have analytic all sorts of stuff all across the spectrum in every department or every university academic setting. And so it's really difficult to say analytic philosophy is just a historical genealogical phenomenon. However, I think there is some truth to the historical aspect, sort of like a historical traditioning, where it's analytic philosophy if you're actively and self-consciously contributing to the debates, to the ongoing debates of analytic philosophy. So in a sense, that might be a useful definition. For me, it comes down to, I think it's a method of doing philosophy after the 19th century that prizes things like clarity, precision, and rigor. And I don't think you need to get too much more in depth. Those are sort of the necessary conditions for what it means to be an analytic philosopher. So you're going to have analytic Thomists, you're going to have analytic all sorts of things. So let me give you some examples of analytic philosophy to give you a sense for it. So here's just an introductory book, An Introduction to Ontology by Nick Effingham. Nick is my PhD supervisor, and he's done, this is an introductory text, but so he does a lot more significantly analytic-y things than just an introductory text. But you come in here, and there's if you're watching on the YouTube, I'm going to try to, let's see here. I know there's stuff that looks like math. You see, you've got these graphs with these charts and these lines and these dots and these explanations. I mean, you're talking about space and time and all these equations and things, and it's like, wow, that's not what I was thinking I'd want to sign up to read, especially late in the evenings. But that is, I think, a simple example of analytic philosophy is what Nick is doing in An Introduction to Ontology. Another example is my friend Ross Inman. Here's his book, Substance and the Fundamentality of the Familiar. If this is a very good book, it's also a very challenging book, and if you look at it, you can see some marks of analytic philosophy. So I'll hold it up there. You can see it. I mean, you're seeing a bunch of little symbols and things that look like you're back in algebra or calculus, right? And there's formalized sort of definitions and formalized arguments and such, where you get this sense for analytic philosophy being very concerned with a sort of style and mode of argument, very concerned with a way of doing philosophy. In contrast to somebody like Jamie Smith, and here, this is one of his books that I pulled off the shelf. If you know James K. A. Smith, I think of him as sort of like not an analytic philosopher, but a continental philosopher. He's interested in, here in this book, in Derrida and others, Foucault, and or however you say his name, whatever. I think I actually enjoyed this book very much, but there's just a very different sense and mode of doing philosophy than what you're finding in analytic content. A useful resource in my mind, if you're really interested in learning this or understanding what it is this little book from Michael Beanie called Analytic Philosophy. It is in the Oxford VSI series, so it's very affordable, it's very short, it's very readable. He takes an approach of, let me kind of show you some analytic philosophy in action so that you can begin to feel it and get a sense for this is how it's done. And then he sort of walks through, here's how you might define it and things. So it's a nice approach, I think, in my mind, a useful introduction to what it is. So let's get to the payoff here. Do you need to know and read analytic philosophy or not? I imagine a lot of you guys who are watching this are not analytic philosophers. Analytic philosophers don't feel the need to watch a video on YouTube on what is analytic philosophy, unless they're really big jerks and annoying and just want to find a reason to critique, which is not above an analytic philosopher. Let's be clear. That's one of the values, though, of analytic philosophy in my mind. They can be total jerks about, like, I'm going to be really picky about this, but they're not jerks in their attitude about it, really. They're generous in it. So you can have a really heated debate, but then you can be friends and shake hands and laugh and do stuff afterwards. That's something that's really attractive in my mind, is sort of less turf wars and more like I want to actually understand the truth and reach that. So we're going to debate and every little detail until we can get to an agreement. So what is, or what was it? It was, do you need to read and know about it? Well, it depends on who you are, right? So if you're a graduate philosophy student, then I think, yeah, you need to be reading analytic philosophy. You need to know what it is. You need to have a good grasp of it, a good context for it. If you're a graduate theology student, I think the same thing. If you're doing theology today, you need to be reading analytic philosophy because you need to be up to speed on the latest current philosophy. Philosophy is supposed to be the handmaiden of theology. If you really believe that, if you believe the classical tradition and how that's supposed to work, that means you should be utilizing, deploying philosophy in an effort to bolster and strengthen theology. And that means not just philosophy of times past, of those dead, but also of those living and coming in the future. You should be utilizing all the best of Egypt and plundering all of it. If you're a pastor, maybe you should care about analytic philosophy. Probably not. You should probably care about analytic theology, not necessarily analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy can be on all manner of range of topics, though. So maybe you do need to study and like, what does it mean for a group to have responsibility beyond just an individual? That's actually a really relevant question. Can the church be responsible for? Can a small group within a church be held responsible for an action that happened? Analytic philosophy actually has a lot of really good literature on this, or there's questions of sexuality and gender or other things that maybe you don't agree with it. That's fine, but there's actually the way that they're attacking and clarifying the problem and offering, here's the 6 different solutions to this problem, and here's why they all fail, or this is why this one's good, can be actually really, really useful. You can save a lot of headache and heartache to have someone else sort of like walk you through, here's all the actual issues at play. Now, if you're a church member, you're probably not going to get a lot of value from analytic philosophy unless you are sort of already a hardcore nerd in whatever you do as a career. There's no harm in not reading a bunch of analytic philosophy. I get it. It's challenging. It's something you really have to immerse yourself into. And over time, you begin to pick up things. You begin to pick up the jargon and the technicalities. So while it does praise clarity and precision, it prizes these things in a particular context. It assumes that you have prior understanding and knowledge about a significant number of things. And so those who are uninitiated might come to it and say, this isn't clear at all. But that's because they don't have the conceptual tools or the baseline sort of ticket to play to make sense of the game. And so, maybe the game is actually really simple and straightforward, but unless you know the basic rules, you'll have no ability to get there. Now, I do think here's another person I guess I could ask, is someone who wants a challenge. And I say, yes, analytic philosophy is for you. I think there are too many things in this world that are easy, that are cheap, that are not very difficult. And if you want a difficult challenge, analytic philosophy is for you. Part of that is what draws me to it. To be honest, it's challenging. It's hard. It makes you think. It makes you stop, and it makes you reevaluate. It makes you think, maybe I don't know all the answers to this, and maybe I have no idea what he's talking about, and I need to reset, ask some questions to really try to get an understanding of what's going on. I think that's awesome. I think it's great to be pushed and to be intellectually stretched. I'd much rather try to climb a very difficult mountain than a simple mountain in most cases, because you will have a greater sense of accomplishment and you will have greater results and achievements. If you're supposed to, the point is to get a great workout, well, then climbing a more difficult mountain is going to give you a better workout. So you're going to have better results from that. So I think analytic philosophy is very useful for a number of people. It has all manner range of topics. You could talk about everything. Like I said, there's group theory, there's stuff about language, there's stuff about whatever question that you have. There's probably analytic philosophy dedicated to thinking about it. I have an essay. It's traditionally analytic theology, but it's drawing on analytic philosophy on multi-site churches. You could deploy these resources to solve any manner of theological problems or questions, or at least to shed some new light on it, or to create a different model or an analogy or whatever. So in my mind, analytic philosophy is very, very useful. Those who denigrate analytic philosophy for not liking metaphysics or something are living in a time past. That was 70 years ago. That's not what happens today. Analytic philosophers are the most serious metaphysicians that are out there now. And they're all they're realists, they're anti-realists, there are moderate realists, everything you can imagine there is an analytic philosophy. It's not just a doctrinal commitment. There's no doctrinal commitment. There's Christians, there's non-Christians, there are realists, anti-realists, there's everything across Platonists, Aristotelians, and people, Humeans, and people all in between. Analytic philosophy is a huge tent today. And there is great philosophy being done here that can be used, deployed, and stolen for the sake of the kingdom. So, yes, this is a little bit of a theological introduction to analytic philosophy, but that's just in part because that's, I think, my audience. Those of you who are watching and listening are in that sort of segment. So if you're not in that, if you are a mathematician, then hopefully this can be still useful because you can realize, it's all this translating math into logic and these different things can be useful for your own context. But I don't think you're probably listening to this. If you are, you should drop a comment and tell me that, wow, I nailed you. Anyway, everybody's been tuning in. I appreciate you guys watching these things. One thing I did want to mention is I got the old school London Lyceum hoodie on today. If you are a loyal listener, we had when we first started as just a podcast, which I think, it says podcast. We had an old school logo that was replaced at some point, but this one had like Spurgeon and a thinking man and different things. And so we've come a long way since that. We're excited about the future. We appreciate your support, and I appreciate you all tuning in to all these videos. I mean, I'm amazed that anybody watches them, but I really appreciate you guys reaching out and letting me know that, hey, this was helpful or not helpful, or I'd love for you to do stuff on this. I think it's awesome. So until next time, I look forward to thinking with you guys soon.